Bourbon whiskey is one of the most tightly regulated spirits on the planet. If you're watching this, you probably already enjoy drinking it. But there is a difference between enjoying bourbon and actually understanding what you are drinking. These are 15 things you need to know about bourbon before you spend another dollar at the liquor store. Number 15. What legally makes bourbon bourbon? This sounds basic, but it is the foundation of everything else in this video. For a whiskey to be called bourbon, it has to meet a very specific set of legal requirements defined in the Federal Standards of Identity for Distilled Spirits. In 1964, the United States Congress declared bourbon a distinctive product of the United States, and the rules have been enforced ever since. The grain mixture called the mash bill must contain at least 51% corn. The spirit must be distilled at no more than 160 proof. It must be entered into brand new charred oak containers at no more than 125 proof, and it must be bottled at no less than 80 proof, which is 40% alcohol by volume. Here is the part that separates bourbon from almost every other whiskey on earth. Nothing can be added to bourbon after distillation except water to bring it down to bottling strength. That means zero flavoring, zero coloring, zero sweeteners, and zero shortcuts of any kind. Compare that to Scotch, which allows caramel coloring, or to many other spirits that permit all kinds of additives. Bourbon is legally required to be exactly what it says it is. Number 14. Bourbon does not have to come from Kentucky. This is one of the most persistent myths in the whiskey world. There is no law, no regulation, and no requirement that says bourbon must be made in Kentucky. It must be made in the United States. That is the only geographic restriction. The reason everyone associates bourbon with Kentucky is simple math. Kentucky produces roughly 95% of the world's bourbon supply, with over 100 licensed distilleries and more than 16 million barrels aging in its warehouses. But bourbon is legally made in New York, Texas, Colorado, Virginia, and dozens of other states. If someone tells you it is not real bourbon because it was not made in Kentucky, they are repeating a myth. Number 13. Straight bourbon, bottled in bond, and regular bourbon are three very different things. Everyone knows the word bourbon. What catches beginners off guard is that there are actually three distinct legal categories within bourbon, and the differences matter more than the label suggests. Regular bourbon has no minimum aging requirement. Technically, a whiskey could touch the inside of a new charred oak barrel for 5 minutes and still be legally called bourbon. That is not a hypothetical. There is no time flaw. Straight bourbon must be aged for a minimum of 2 years in new charred oak barrels and cannot contain any added coloring, flavoring, or other spirits. If it is aged less than 4 years, the label must state the exact age. If it is aged 4 years or more, the age statement becomes optional. Bottled in bond is the strictest designation. It is governed by the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897, one of the first consumer protection laws in American history. To carry this label, the bourbon must be the product of one distillery, made during one distilling season, aged for a minimum of 4 years in a federally bonded warehouse, and bottled at exactly 100 proof. When you see bottled in bond on a label, you are looking at a government-backed quality guarantee that has been in place for over 100 years. Number 12. That age number on the bottle is not what you think. When you see a number on a bourbon bottle, for example 6 years, it does not mean all the whiskey inside is exactly 6 years old. It means the youngest whiskey in that bottle spent at least 6 years in a barrel. The rest could be significantly older. Distillers blend whiskies of different ages together to hit a consistent flavor profile. A bottle labeled 6 years could contain bourbon that is 8, 10, or even 12 years old, blended in to achieve the taste the master distiller is after. Distilleries are not required to tell you the ages of the older components. They just cannot misrepresent the youngest one. This also explains no age statement bottles, often called NAS. These releases carry no age on the label, which means the distillery is not guaranteeing anything beyond the legal minimum for whatever designation it carries. And one more thing that trips people up. Unlike wine, bourbon does not continue to age once it is bottled. A 6-year-old bourbon that has been sitting unopened on a shelf for 20 years is still a 6-year-old bourbon. The aging clock stops the moment the liquid leaves the barrel. Number 11. Kentucky has more barrels of bourbon than people, and the weather is a big reason why. As of early 2025, there are over 16 million barrels of bourbon and other spirits aging in warehouses across Kentucky. The state has roughly 4.5 million residents. That is more than 3 barrels for every person living there. Every year, a percentage of the liquid inside each barrel evaporates through the wood. Distillers call this the angel's share. In Kentucky, where summers are brutally hot and winters are freezing cold, the annual loss runs 3 to 5%, significantly higher than the 2% typical in Scotland's cooler climate. But Kentucky's extreme temperature swings are also bourbon's secret weapon. During summer, the wood expands and the bourbon pushes deep into the charred oak, extracting vanilla, caramel, and toffee. During winter, the wood contracts and pushes the bourbon back out. This seasonal breathing cycle is the reason bourbon can achieve in 4 to 6 years what Scotch often takes 12 or more years to develop. The trade-off is volume loss. By the time a barrel has aged 8 to 10 years in Kentucky, a significant portion of the original liquid is gone. That math is a major reason why older bourbons get exponentially more expensive. Number 10. Sour mash is a process, not a flavor. If there is one term in bourbon that confuses beginners more than any other, it is sour mash. It appears on bottles and it sounds like a flavor description, but it has nothing to do with how the bourbon actually tastes. Sour mash refers to a production technique where a portion of the spent mash from a previous distillation run, called backset or stillage, is added to the new batch of grain and water. Think of it like a sourdough starter. The acidic leftover from the last batch lowers the pH of the new mash, which creates an environment where the distiller's yeast can thrive and unwanted bacteria cannot. It also helps maintain consistency from one batch to the next. Here is the part that surprises people. Virtually every major bourbon distillery in the United States uses the sour mash process, whether they put it on the label or not. Jim Beam, Wild Turkey, Maker's Mark, Woodford Reserve, Buffalo Trace are all sour mash. The label is not telling you something special about the bourbon, it is telling you about a process that the entire industry uses by default. Number 9. The mash bill is the flavor blueprint, and it matters more than you think. The mash bill is the recipe of grains that goes into the fermentation process. Bourbon requires at least 51% corn, but the remaining 49% is where distillers make their mark. There are 2 main styles you need to know. Traditional bourbon uses corn, rye, and malted barley. The rye adds spice, pepper, and a dry edge. Brands like Four Roses, Bulleit, and Woodford Reserve use higher proportions of rye in their recipes, and these bourbons tend to be bolder and more assertive on the palate. Wheated bourbon replaces the rye with wheat. Wheat delivers a softer, sweeter, rounder flavor profile. Maker's Mark is the most famous wheated bourbon, and the entire Pappy Van Winkle lineup uses a wheated mash bill. These bourbons lean toward honey, bread, and a gentle warmth. Learning which style you prefer is one of the fastest ways to narrow down the shelf and find bottles you will actually enjoy. Number 8. Charred oak is the reason bourbon tastes like bourbon. This is arguably the most important rule in all of bourbon production. Every drop of bourbon must be aged in brand new charred oak barrels. Not used barrels, not refill barrels, new ones, every single time. The charring process involves setting the inside of the barrel on fire for a controlled period. The industry recognizes 4 char levels, from a light 15-second toast all the way up to a deep 55-second char that creates a layer of carbon on the inside of the barrel called the alligator char because of its cracked scaly appearance. That char layer acts as a natural filter. It strips out harsh sulfur compounds from the new make spirit while simultaneously unlocking the sugars and vanillin inside the oak. This is where bourbon gets its signature notes of vanilla, caramel, toffee, butterscotch, and baking spice. Without new charred oak, bourbon would taste nothing like bourbon. And here is the global ripple effect. Because American law requires new barrels for every batch of bourbon, the industry generates an enormous surplus of high-quality used barrels after every fill. Those barrels get shipped by the thousands to Scotland, Ireland, Japan, the Caribbean, and everywhere else whiskey and rum are produced. The Scotch industry depends on ex-bourbon barrels. Roughly 9 out of every 10 casks aging Scotch in Scotland right now originally held bourbon. Without this single American law, the global whiskey industry as we know it would not exist. Number 7. Proof and barrel. Not the same conversation. Proof is simply twice the alcohol by volume. A bourbon bottled at 90 proof is 45% alcohol. That part is straightforward. Where it gets interesting is barrel proof, sometimes called cask strength. When a distillery bottles at barrel proof, they are giving you the bourbon exactly as it comes out of the barrel with no water added to lower the strength. That typically means somewhere between 110 and 140 proof, depending on how long it aged and where the barrel sat in the warehouse. The advantage is control. Instead of the distillery deciding how much water to add, you get to dial in the strength yourself. Start it neat, add a few drops of water, add a splash. Every adjustment changes the character slightly, releasing different aromas and flavors at different dilution levels. Quick thing before we get to number 6 on this list. The data on this channel shows that over 80% of you watching right now are not subscribed. That means you are showing up for the content, but the algorithm has no reason to show you the next video. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about what goes in your glass. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Number 6. How to actually nose and taste bourbon properly. This is where beginners make their first mistake. Almost everyone does the same thing. They stick their nose into the glass and take a deep sniff. From 45% to 65% alcohol, that is like sniffing rubbing alcohol. It overwhelms your olfactory receptors and you cannot smell anything except ethanol for the next few minutes. Instead, hold the glass about 2 inches from your nose. Keep your lips slightly parted. Breathe in gently through both your nose and your mouth at the same time. The open mouth technique pulls vapor across your palate and up through the back of your nasal passage, where the real aroma detection happens. Start further away and slowly bring the glass closer as your nose adjusts. On the palate, let the bourbon sit on your tongue for a moment before you swallow. The finish, what you taste after you swallow, is often where the most interesting flavors emerge. Do not rush. The difference between gulping bourbon and tasting bourbon is about 3 extra seconds of patience. Number 5. How to read a bourbon label and know what you are buying. A bourbon label is trying to tell you a story, but you have to know the language. Start with the designation. Is it bourbon whiskey, straight bourbon, or bottled in bond? That tells you how long it aged and what rules governed its production. Next, check the proof. 80 is the legal minimum. 90 to 100 is where a lot of bourbon hits its stride. Barrel proof means you are getting it undiluted. Look for an age statement. If there is a number, it represents the youngest whiskey in the bottle. If there is no number, the distillery chose not to commit to one. Check the back label for the phrase distilled by versus bottled by. Distilled by means that company actually made the bourbon. Bottled by means they purchased it from someone else and put their label on it. This distinction matters more than almost anything else on the bottle. What a bourbon label does not tell you is often just as revealing. There is no requirement to disclose the mash bill, no requirement to list where the grain was sourced, and no requirement to explain what small batch or handcrafted actually means, because legally those terms mean nothing. Number 4. Adding water or ice to bourbon is not wrong. It is chemistry. There is a persistent idea that real bourbon drinkers only drink it neat. That is a myth that needs to go away. Adding water to bourbon is one of the oldest practices in the industry, and there is actual science behind why it works. At higher proof levels, ethanol molecules in bourbon tend to cluster together and can trap flavor compounds inside those clusters. When you add water, it disrupts those clusters and pushes aroma and flavor molecules toward the surface of the liquids where your nose and palate can detect them. A few drops of water literally unlock flavors that were hidden in the alcohol. Master distillers and blenders at every major bourbon distillery taste their whiskey with water. They often dilute it to around 20% alcohol by volume for professional evaluation. If the people who make the bourbon add water, so can you. Ice is a different conversation. It chills the bourbon, and that suppresses some volatile aromatics. Lighter bourbons often hold up well over ice. Higher proof, more complex bourbons tend to reveal more with a few drops of room temperature water instead. Taste it neat first, then add water gradually. Notice what changes. That process teaches your palate more than any list of tasting notes ever could. Number 3. The secondary market is a trap for beginners. Over the last decade, bourbon has experienced an allocation frenzy unlike anything in the history of American spirits. Bottles that were designed to retail at $50 or $60 are now selling for $500, $1,000, or even several $1,000s on the secondary market. Pappy Van Winkle is the most famous example. The 15-year expression carries a suggested retail price of around $240. On the secondary market, that same bottle regularly sells for well over $1,000. Other examples include the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, Weller Full Proof, and Blanton's. All of these have become targets for flippers and collectors who treat bourbon like a commodity rather than something to drink. The reality is that allocated bourbon is excellent whiskey at its intended retail price. At secondary prices, the liquid almost never justifies the markup. Beginners who chase allocated bottles before learning what they actually enjoy are throwing money at hype. The smartest approach is to explore the enormous range of readily available bourbon, figure out which styles you prefer, and let the allocated bottles find you if they ever do. Number 2. Small batch and craft are marketing terms with no legal definition. When you see small batch on a bourbon label, it sounds exclusive. It sounds limited. It sounds like someone carefully selected a handful of special barrels just for this bottle. And in some cases, that is exactly what happened. But legally, small batch means nothing. A distillery could blend 5 barrels and call it small batch. They could blend 5,000 barrels and call it small batch. There is no regulation, no barrel count minimum or maximum, and no oversight on the term. Craft and handcrafted follow the same pattern with no legal definition, no standard, and no enforcement behind the words. And then there are non-distiller producers, often called NDP. These are companies that purchase bourbon from larger distilleries and bottle it under their own brand. There is nothing inherently wrong with this. Some respected names in bourbon have sourced whiskey at various points. But when a label says bottled by instead of distilled by, the consumer deserves to know that the liquid came from somewhere else. Indiana's MGP distillery is one of the largest sources of contract distilled bourbon in the country. Dozens of brands on your liquor store shelf were distilled there, even if the front label never mentions Indiana. Knowing this does not make the bourbon worse, but it means you should pay attention to who actually made what you are drinking, especially when the price climbs. Number 1. The only rule that actually matters. After everything in this video, after the legal definitions, the production secrets, the label decoding, and the tasting techniques, there is one thing that overrides all of it. Your palate is the only critic that matters. Bourbon is not a competition. There is no prize for drinking the most expensive bottle or for having the most obscure taste. If you love a $30 bottle of Evan Williams single barrel more than a $300 allocated release, that is not a failure of your palate. That is your palate doing exactly what it is supposed to do, telling you what you enjoy. Start with bottles you can afford, try different mash bills, try wheated, try high rye, try bottled in bond. Pay attention to what keeps bringing you back for another pour. When you find it, go deeper into that style. That is how you build a collection that actually makes you happy instead of one that just looks impressive on a shelf. The best bourbon in the world is the one you look forward to pouring. If this changed how you think about bourbon, subscribe. More videos like this are already in the pipeline and you do not want to miss them.